They counted on noise. They believed their chaos could drown out your clarity. While they screamed, you listened. While they assembled groups to mimic power, you walked alone with intent. Every trap they laid was designed for someone reactive, someone impulsive, someone who feared misunderstanding more than miscalculation. But you became the storm that never shouted. You were the silence that struck without a hint of forecast. Their entire playbook depended on spectacle, and you robbed them of their audience. That was your move. The most lethal one. The one they never anticipated, because it was done without applause, without theater, without hesitation. The most dangerous moves are always quiet. They monitored your expressions like stock prices, looking for dips in confidence, cracks in resolve. They mistook your patience for hesitation. They saw your detachment and interpreted it as weakness. The only metrics they trusted were emotional leakage and public opinion. That's why they failed to detect the real threat. You weren't building a reaction, you were sharpening a response. And when it landed, it wasn't lethal, it was surgical, precise, cold. You didn't attack, you neutralized, you didn't expose them. You made them irrelevant. And irrelevance, for people who crave perception, is the slowest death imaginable. They rehearsed for confrontation. You rehearsed for completion. While they read books on manipulation and tactics, you were studying yourself. You understood your own rage, your own wounds, your own capacity for restraint. You didn't act to prove anything. You acted because you saw the flaw in their entire structure. Their egos were built like dominoes, one confident piece leaning on another. So you pulled the silent tile from the bottom row and watched them fall under the illusion that gravity had betrayed them. But it was you. Always you. They were so addicted to the idea of power that they forgot the necessity of timing. Timing isn't dramatic, it's invisible. You waited, not because you were unsure, but because you were aligned. That's the move they never anticipate, stillness, because stillness requires mastery. And when you finally moved, you didn't rush forward. You redirected the entire board. No shouts, no warnings, no debate, just a shift. They found themselves in checkmate without realizing the game had already ended 3 moves ago. That's not magic, that's mind. That's mastery. People think the most lethal move is the loud one, the final punch, the victorious scream. No, the most lethal move is the one that leaves no fingerprints, the one that doesn't get broadcasted, the one that rewrites reality without needing to rewrite the script. You didn't defeat them. You redefined the terms of engagement. That's why they're confused. They don't know when they lost. They just know something changed, and now they're no longer relevant to the story. The curtains closed while they were still midline. The funny thing is, they thought the danger was your anger, your words, your ambition. No, the real danger was your clarity, your restraint, the space between your thoughts. That void between stimulus and response where most people self-destruct. You mastered it. You didn't let them provoke you into a reaction they could control. You stayed behind the veil, let them guess, let them panic. The lethal move wasn't the blow, it was the awareness. The awareness that none of this was worth your identity. You studied their desperation like a surgeon studies an open wound. You didn't stop them from digging deeper graves. You handed them sharper shovels and better lighting. Every time they pushed, you absorbed. Every insult, every lie, every underhanded move. You logged it not for revenge, but for calibration. Then, just once with perfect timing and no ceremony, you stepped aside, and all their force collided with nothing. That's what broke them. They never anticipated the elegance of non-resistance. They never saw that your evolution had gone internal. They assumed you were still playing their game, waiting your turn, following rules. But you stopped playing. You became the terrain. They moved pieces, you became the board. They relied on attention, you embodied presence. The moment you did that, the game was no longer theirs to win. You didn't need to announce it. People felt it. The temperature shifted, eyes turned. And those who had dismissed you now couldn't stop looking. The irony is that they still don't know what you did. They dissected events, timestamps, conversations, trying to pinpoint where it went wrong. But what you did wasn't an action. It was a transformation. You became immune to their structure. Their methods required your participation, and you dissolved from the formula. That's the lethal move. The vanishing act of the soul. Not escape, not surrender, but transcendence. You stopped being a player. You became the storm front that doesn't need validation to end a war. They braced for an explosion. They studied your habits like forensic scientists, trying to predict the blast radius of a soul pushed too far. They laid traps shaped like apologies and waited for you to step in, just to watch you combust. They baited the pressure points they assumed still controlled you, convinced that if they pressed the right emotional detonator, you'd destroy yourself publicly and give them the satisfaction of a meltdown they could point to and say, "See, we were right about you." But you didn't scream. You didn't lash out. You didn't burn the room. You rebuilt the architecture of your mind and set it ablaze instead. You took the war inward, and what came out of that fire was not rage, it was reinvention. They planned for a riot and were met with a resurrection. They came prepared with buckets of water for the flames they expected. Apologies rehearsed. PR damage control drafted in silence. Whispered conversations behind your back in case you turned explosive. That's how little they understood your silence. They mistook it for patience when it was actually rebirth. You weren't pausing. You were transforming. You weren't on the edge, they were. The old version of you, the one they knew how to provoke, had been buried in the ashes of every insult, every dismissal, every betrayal they thought you would carry forever. But instead of carrying it, you converted it. Their cruelty was your clay. Their doubt was your steel. Their gossip was your blueprint. They expected fire. You gave them form. That's what disturbed them. The lack of chaos, the precision of your return. They trained for a monster and were met with a monument. You weren't the storm anymore. You became the land reshaped by it. They expected you to scream. You smiled. They braced for retaliation. You moved in silence. They expected your energy to spiral outward into destruction. Instead, it compressed, refardened. When you finally spoke, it wasn't with volume. It was with weight. You changed rooms without needing to raise a voice. You altered expectations without lifting a finger. Because the most terrifying thing about reinvention is that it removes their power to define you. And that's what they hate the most. Not that you survived, but that you evolved beyond their framework. They rehearsed their own villain arc against a version of you that no longer existed. They wanted your rage because it would have justified their guilt. Your anger would have made you predictable. They needed you reactive, messy, impulsive, because then they could still feel superior, still play savior or victim depending on the crowd. But you didn't flinch. You didn't perform. You reinvented so thoroughly that even they couldn't recognize you. And when you looked at them again, with eyes that no longer begged to be seen, they felt the weight of their irrelevance. That's the part they never prepared for. The moment they became background noise in the story they tried to hijack. They underestimated what solitude does to someone who chooses it. You didn't isolate to escape. You isolated to re-engineer. While they kept throwing stones at a version of you that had already dissolved, you were somewhere building architecture from the inside, rewiring your nervous system, studying your shadows, giving your past a eulogy and not a pedestal. And when you remerged, they called it ego. They called it cold. They called it not the real you. Because they couldn't control it. Because it didn't need them. Because it invalidated everything they assumed was permanent. You took your pain, fed it discipline, bathed it in silence, and sculpted it into presence. They feared the confrontation, but what unnerved them more was your absence. You walked away instead of biting. You vanished instead of engaging. And that disappearing act, that was the start of your evolution. Because when someone refuses to fight back, it's not always submission. Sometimes it's surgery. Sometimes it's the first cut of a scalpel carving out weakness. You remove the parts of yourself they used to reach, the buttons they pushed, the versions they memorized. You replaced them with edge, with clarity, with neutrality so dangerous they couldn't predict your next move. You became unrateable, and that is the ultimate power. They trained for your rage because it would have made them martyrs. Rage would have made you loud, chaotic, easy to blame. Reinvention, on the other hand, forced them to face their own insignificance. When you didn't react, they had to confront the fact that they were no longer central to your emotional ecosystem. They weren't villains. They weren't heroes. They were footnotes. And nothing terrifies narcissism like irrelevance. You could have torn them down with fury, but instead, you walked past them with elevation. They screamed into the void, and you were too high to hear it. They watched you from the corner now, eyes wide, mouths tight, no longer brave, no longer smug, because you didn't return with apologies or explanations. You returned with silence that cracked foundations, with poise that made their accusations seem childish, with presence so refined it turned their sabotage into folklore. They tried to speak your name like a weapon, and it came out sounding ancient, dated, because that name now lived in a frequency they couldn't access. You outgrew their ability to describe you. And that is a spiritual revenge most people will never comprehend. You taught them a cruel truth, that people who build identities on your flaws will fall apart when you evolve. Their entire script collapsed. They had lines prepared for your anger, quotes saved for your breakdown, but none of it fit anymore. You were no longer the person they wrote those narratives for. You were a different entity entirely, one that renders their rehearsed roles meaningless. And now they have to stand there, fumbling their lines, trying to resurrect a story you outgrew. That's the cost of betting against someone who reinvents instead of reacts. They thought reinvention was just a rebrand, a change of clothes, a few motivational quotes. They didn't understand that real reinvention is violent. It's surgical, it hurts. It requires letting go of parts of yourself that once kept you alive. It demands burial, death, resurrection. And you did it, alone, in silence, without their applause or approval. That's why you scare them now. Because you didn't need them to climb. You didn't need their validation to change. You burned the whole theater and built a cathedral. One that doesn't allow entry to the actors they used to be. They thought you would react. That was their only plan. They sculpted entire strategies around the belief that you couldn't resist the bait. They designed traps not to hurt you, but to provoke you into hurting yourself. Because people like them rely on prediction, not perception. They're not built to deal with silence. They're built to manipulate noise. And when you didn't take the swing, when you didn't respond, when your voice didn't echo in the hall of their expectations, they grew uneasy. You didn't flinch, you smiled. That subtle curl of indifference terrified them, because it meant you saw it, the whole setup, the desperation behind their mask. And instead of tearing it down, you simply stepped back, not to retreat, but to let gravity finish what pride had started. They were performing, grandstanding, turning every interaction into a stage play. And while they were improvising their greatness, you had already stepped out of the theater. They mistook your silence for absence. They mistook your patience for submission. But it was a surgical form of dominance. You knew that pride blindfolds fools better than any illusion. And so you waited. You didn't argue. You didn't correct. You didn't rescue them from the consequences of their overconfidence. You just smiled and let their ego walk freely, like a drunk king parading into a pit of spears, convinced the applause was for him. They believed they were rising, but all they were doing was removing the safeguards, disarming their own defenses. Your trap didn't need wires. It needed time. The brilliance of your restraint wasn't in action. It was orchestration. You let them perform. You let them convince the room they were in control. You let them build their tower of delusion brick by brick, higher and louder, until the fall would echo louder than any response you could have given. They underestimated the impact of a well-timed absence. You weren't trying to win the moment. You were dismantling the premise. Because sometimes, the most devastating move is no move at all. Let the weight of their own performance collapse their footing. Let them dig deeper with every boast. Let them climb higher with every self-congratulatory lie. You were never trying to push them. You were just waiting for the wind to shift. You understood the physics of ego. It builds upward without foundation. All you needed to do was step aside and let momentum become their enemy. You knew their arrogance required your energy. They needed your resistance to validate their identity. But you gave them none. You became air invisible, unyielding, and they ran straight into the illusion of their own power. They didn't just fall, they shattered. Because when ego crashes, it doesn't just bruise, it breaks bones. It dissolves narratives. And in that collapse, every bystander sees the truth you never had to explain. You orchestrated exposure without lifting a hand. They played to the crowd. You played to time. They thought short-term applause meant long-term control. They didn't realize that real power doesn't need performance. It doesn't need to speak loudly or react emotionally. It doesn't posture. It simply aligns with the truth and lets lies corrode in open air. That was your advantage. You weren't trying to prove who you were. You were watching them reveal who they were not. Your restraint wasn't weakness. It was discipline. And your discipline turned into destiny. One they never saw coming because they were too busy trying to make you flinch. You saw their trap, smelled the bait, read the script, and then rewrote the ending without even touching the page. That's why it stung. Because they needed your participation to win. They needed you to swing, to shout, to stumble. But you didn't. You observed. Let them exhaust themselves, proving nothing. And then the silence did what no argument could. It exposed, it disarmed, it humiliated. Because when you walk away from a fight they prepared their whole identity around, you take the oxygen out of their cause, and their whole world begins to suffocate in its own delusion. What haunts them now is not what you said. It's what you didn't say. It's the way your silence feels louder than their entire performance. They think about your smile, calm, measured, knowing. They replay the moment you stepped back. They search it for signs of weakness, for proof you were afraid. But all they find is precision. All they feel is the cold void of being outplayed by absence. They didn't realize you weren't avoiding battle. You were mastering it, turning it inward, sharpening your soul until it no longer bled. And when it came time for impact, it wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. They don't know how they lost. That's what eats them. Because you never laid a finger. You never retaliated. You didn't sabotage or expose. You just vanished from their framework and let the architecture collapse. They were left yelling at shadows, attacking reflections, swinging at ghosts. You became untouchable not by hiding, but by evolving, by refusing to match their chaos, by elevating beyond the petty script they had rehearsed. You became a mirror too clean to reflect their distortion, and that clarity broke them more than any blow could have. They prepared for battle. You prepared for after. You were never interested in winning the war they offered. You were interested in becoming the kind of force that didn't need to fight to win. That's the real power. To bait without baiting. To kill a narrative by starving it. To watch your enemies stumble into pits they designed for you, and never even feel the need to say, "I told you so." Because your success made their betrayal irrelevant. Your glow made their bitterness invisible. Your calm made their chaos embarrassing. And now, long after the dust has settled, they sit there, wondering how they lost to someone who never fought, wondering how their trap caught no one but themselves, wondering why the smile you gave them that day still lives in their mind. It's because it wasn't a smile of revenge. It was the smile of someone who knows how the game ends. And that's what will haunt them forever. They never stood a chance. Not because you were more aggressive, but because you had already left the battlefield before they even unsheathed their pride. They thought presence was your only weapon. They thought silence meant surrender. They built their entire strategy around the assumption that you needed the room, the attention, the applause. So when you vanished, truly vanished, not in anger, not in theatrics, but in full, divine detachment, they didn't celebrate, they panicked. Because people only understand power through volume and proximity. They never learned to respect absence. They thought your disappearance was retreat, but you weren't escaping. You were ascending. And they had no frame of reference for someone who doesn't flinch, doesn't explain, doesn't warn. You walked out without looking back, and in doing so, you exposed how dependent they were on being observed. You didn't leave the room. You removed the mirror. They waited for the comeback, the breakdown, the apology, the retaliation, any signal to confirm their narrative that you couldn't live without the drama. They gave it a week, then a month. Then silence became their stalker. They refreshed pages. They watched your last scene. They asked mutuals. Because your disappearance wasn't a retreat. It was a shift in gravitational pull. When someone used to orbit your light, your absence feels like an apocalypse. They underestimated your ability to detach because they never developed one themselves. They thought detachment required coldness, but it's the opposite. It requires self-respect. It requires healing. It requires choosing peace over proving. Disappearance is the final flex because it removes the currency of reaction. You offered no closure, no dialogue, no visible anger to soothe their guilt. That's what made it lethal. Because people like them survive on loopholes. At least they shouted. At least they cried. At least they cared enough to fight. But you cared too much to stay. That's what broke them. You didn't walk away bitter. You walked away full. And full people don't argue with emptiness. You didn't warn them. You didn't beg for understanding. You gave them the most brutal gift of all, permanent silence and absolute removal. They thought you vanished because you lost. They don't realize you vanished because you won. Vanishing is not about going invisible. It's about becoming unavailable to the game. They still operate in rooms you no longer enter, discuss rules you no longer follow, create drama for an audience you outgrew. They whisper your name like a spell, hoping to summon your old self. But that version was cremated in private and buried without ceremony. You didn't just leave. You erased their ability to summon a response. And now they sit there with their loaded stories and no one left to shoot. People fear being forgotten, but the real fear is being remembered incorrectly and not having access to rewrite it. That's the power of disappearing.